What if I told you that a group of Arizona cowboys shot and killed a pterodactyl?
I would say that sounds awesome.
Does it sound plausible?
Yes.
Well, this should be interesting then. My name is Matt. I am a novelist.
And I'm Brian. I'm a designer and illustrator.
We team up to create books about dinosaurs, the ancient world, and mysteries. We love this stuff.
But we don't always agree on it.
We are Thunderbirds. They're amazing. They appear in the legends and tales of Native Americans from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes, to the Southwest, to the East Coast, to the Great Plains. Specifics will vary from region to region, but they're almost always huge winged creatures that are symbols of power and often supernatural might. Are these Thunderbirds only legends, or could they be based on something very real and very cool? All right, here's the story. On April 26th, 1890, the Tombstone Epitaph, the daily newspaper of Tombstone, Arizona, published a very eye-catching article. That newspaper article told the story of a group of cowboys who, while riding across the plains, came across a giant winged monster. This winged monster seemed to be very tired from a long flight. These cowboys gave chase on their horses and pursued the winged monster for several miles. The monster then put up a fight, and the cowboys put an end to the monster with their Winchester rifles. The cowboys measured the creature and found that its wingspan was 160 feet long. Its head was over 8 feet long. The creature seemed to almost resemble a flying alligator, but it had an extremely long tail and an immense pair of leathery bat-like wings. Other newspapers picked up this crazy story, and for a while it seemed to have a little bit of local buzz. However, the story went largely forgotten until the 1960s, when a man named Jack Pearl wrote an article about it in a publication called Saga. In it, he described seeing a photo of the creature, stating that the cowboys had drugged this, what resembled a huge bird, and nailed it to a wall with its wings outspread, several men in front of it. This account in the publication Saga triggered a flood of anecdotes from others who were sure they'd seen the photo somewhere before. They just couldn't quite find it. And that's sort of where we stand. This crazy account from a newspaper, this remembering of the account about 70 years later, and a flood of people who are sure they saw a photograph of this somewhere. Brian, do you think these cowboys actually shot and killed a pterodactyl?
Well, Matt, I'm going to begin to answer your question by building my foundation on if it's even plausible that a Thunderbird could actually exist. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
All right. So, as you've mentioned, Thunderbirds, they have appeared throughout Native American folklore, as you've said, from all the way up in Alaska, all the way down through South America. There's stories from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And as you said, these stories vary, but they all have a single thread that gives them some plausibility. I'm going to start off by giving just a few examples from various Native American tribes from across the country. All right. So first off, the Sioux. They have many tales of warriors killing the Thunderbird. If you go up to the Pacific Northwest region of the United States and into Canada, those Native American tribes have lots of stories of these Thunderbird creatures having wingspans twice as long as their war canoes, and actually have reports of them attacking whales. Funny enough, those same tribes feared being in the water when killer whales were in the water, but they knew that the killer whales feared the Thunderbird. So they would paint Thunderbirds on the bottom of their canoes to scare off the killer whales. So one interesting story that's a little more specific, the Pima Indians. These are in the Sonora Desert. So they have a story of these flying man-eating beasts that would live in the caves in the mountains surrounding them. The warriors that were getting fed up with these beasts swooping down and killing all their people came up with a plan. They thought they would go up to the cave where they knew the beast lived, and they would block the entrance and set fire to it. And they actually killed the beast. And funny enough, so they did this multiple times. They killed multiple creatures this way. And when the Spaniards came across and were talking to these Native American tribes, they actually showed them the bones of this thunderbird to Cortez, and he took these bones back to Spain with him of a thunderbird. There are also some pictographs around America. There's some in Utah, Colorado, so kind of around the western region of the United States. Some of them are a little bit debated. One specifically in Utah that grew a lot of popularity. There's been some debate if it's actually 3 pictures put together or if it's 1 picture of a pterosaur. Lastly, moving down from North America into Central and South America, there are also many stories of similar creatures in that area as well. There have even been some missionaries who have reported seeing beasts like this in the area and hearing different tales similar to the ones that I've told in the North American region that kind of have that same thread throughout that kind of gives you, again, that sense of credibility to these stories when they're happening to different cultures and different parts of the Americas. All of that being said, did these cowboys actually kill a thunderbird? So, is it possible? Yes, I think it is very possible that they killed a thunderbird. However, I do think the circumstances around this is very odd. If you Google cowboys with thunderbird, you will get lots of pictures of supposed cowboys standing next to a pterodactyl. All of which I would bet some money on that are photoshopped, right? There's even examples of the picture that you talked about, right? Where it's the large, I would probably call it a Quetzalcoatlus because it's that big, right? With the huge wingspan, and there's like 6 men like stretching with their arms out underneath it. Again, the main picture in this news article has never really been found or documented. It's kind of like, hey, we remember this picture being in the newspaper and this story that came through. So it's one of those things where I'm like, is it possible that cowboys and people that were moving across the West were encountering these creatures and possibly killing them? Yes. However, this specific story, I have a little bit of hesitation towards just because of the lack of like evidence, because we're talking about a picture here and we don't have the picture. It's just people like, I saw a picture of that.
Yeah, so that is a good distinction to make here, because there's really 2 different questions we could ask. One, do we think it's plausible that thunderbirds could have existed as some sort of real creature? And 2, is this particular story about a thunderbird believable? It sounds like me and you both agree on this particular story about the Arizona Cowboys that it is not believable. You touched on some.
With me?
Isn't it crazy? So you touched on some of these already, but I'll just sort of go through some more. First of all, this did not get nearly the amount of press coverage that we would expect if it was actually a true story. For instance, at this time, Tombstone, Arizona had 2 daily newspapers, the Tombstone Epitaph and the Nugget. The Nugget never mentioned this story, which you'd think they would if someone actually shot a 160-foot winged monster.
I would be writing about that one.
They never had any follow-up articles, and they never mentioned the Cowboys by name, and they never posted a picture. Like you mentioned earlier as well, Brian, this seems to be a classic case of something called the Mandela effect. It's basically a shorthand for how large groups of people can all have the same shared false memory. It's very well documented. You all can go down a very interesting YouTube rabbit hole on the Mandela effect.
Did Fruit of the Loom have a cornucopia?
Exactly. Did Sherlock Holmes say, "Elementary, my dear Watson"? You know, all that stuff. There's so many examples of this happening. And this seems to be what happened with Jack Pearl after his 1963 article in Saga. He had this false memory of seeing a photo accompanying this article. A lot of other people did too. Because lots of people remembered the same thing, they assumed it was real. And to be clear, I don't think these people were necessarily lying. I think they really believe that they saw it. It's a false memory. So I think we can put that issue to bed relatively easily, right? Unless you want to say something in favor of the newspaper man from the Tombstone Epitaph.
I really want to meet this man and talk to him about it, but unfortunately he's dead now.
And that leads to the other point where it was not uncommon for bored newspapermen at the time to make up sensational stories. Were they trying to sell newspapers? Were they just feeling bored? Whatever. These happened. They're documented. It's totally plausible that this random dude at the Tombstone Epitaph, for a lark, told this crazy story.
Just to play devil's advocate with you for a second here. Yes, I would agree that this newspaper editor probably was bored looking for a story, right? But is it plausible that maybe he had heard stories like this of cowboys who had encountered these type of creatures, and also heard from the Native Americans and the folklore of these creatures, them also encountering it? So that's maybe where he got the idea. So maybe it's like an inspired story from things he had heard from locals, from other people, but he did not have any concrete evidence to put names to the faces or anything like that. So he was able to kind of elaborate on it, make it as big as he wanted, do all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, and it definitely seems to be the case that stories like this were sort of percolating around this time period. To give just a few of the many examples, on January 1882, the Arizona Weekly Citizen had a story about a monster eagle with a wingspan over 7 feet that was killed after attacking a man. 2 months after that, the New York Times and the Sacramento Daily Record Union relayed a report from another newspaper about how 2 lumberjacks had encountered this giant bird with crocodile-like qualities. So yes, to your point, this story is not just a one-off that comes out of nowhere. It's part of a tradition of crazy flying monster stories that were sort of percolating during this time period.
Yeah. And where do you think the crazy monster stories came from, though?
And that gets us to the second part here, right? I think we can agree that this particular Tombstone, Arizona account is highly suspect.
Mm-hmm.
But whether or not it's suspect, that doesn't really address the underlying point, which is it plausible to believe that these Thunderbird legends are based on an actual creature? Let me say sort of some of my priors here, and maybe you can respond. Prior number one, again, me and you come at this from different ways. You believe in a young Earth, I believe in an older Earth. So for me, it seems very implausible for any of these creatures to survive that long. Not impossible, but improbable. So that sort of affects how I go into this from the start. But even if we move beyond that, there's another issue of if these giant flying things are around, we're going to see them a lot because they're literally up in the air, right? So what's your response to that criticism that if they're flying, we're going to see them?
Well, how many bald eagles have you seen, Matt?
I saw one in the wild. Oh, Brian, when I was driving from Springfield, Missouri down to Little Rock this Thanksgiving, I saw a bald eagle by the side of the road. It was the coolest thing.
I saw one in Wisconsin last year.
Well, there we go.
That was my first ever bald eagle I've ever seen.
It was amazing.
Right.
But yes, your point
Yes.
being, we know bald eagles exist, but still very
Yes.
rare that any individual one of us would see them.
Exactly. And these creatures, if it's even fewer of a population than bald eagles, I'm assuming at this point, and there's fewer people in the West at this point as well than there are right now, obviously you're not going to be seeing that many creatures flying around in the sky. It's going to be very few and far between when sightings happen. So even when they do happen, it's going to be very rare, and it could eventually even be exaggerated into these like 100-foot wingspan creatures when they're seeing something very odd and out of the ordinary, and it is a very large flying, possibly reptilian creature.
So do you believe these creatures could still be alive, or do you think like the last vestiges of them were killed off by cowboys or whatever?
Do I still think they're in existence? I don't know. In North America, I would probably say no. Central South America, I would say possible, because who knows what the heck is in the Amazon jungle. So North America, I would say probably not, but possibly further south.
Okay, so that makes more sense to me. I think it's extremely unlikely that there's any of these still roaming around in, North America. But I am open to it being possible, not likely, but possible that maybe these existed, thousands of years ago when there's only a small population of indigenous folks in the area. So to that, I think your argument earlier was a lot of these different people, from Pacific Northwest to East Coast, Great Plains, Southwest, all had stories, But I think you were also saying that these stories seem to indicate a living creature as opposed to something that's just mythological. Is that what you were saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. It seems plausible to me that because all of these different cultures across the country, across North America, Central America, South America, all have stories of similar creatures. Yes, some of them have different attributes than others, but if you look at just like the baseline of like what are these creatures, large flying creatures, then it seems plausible that something like that was around when these people groups were here.
So, obviously, Brian, I'm cheering for your theory because the thought of having a population of living pterodactyls or other pterosaurs in North America
Mhm.
in the recent past is amazing. I will say
Yeah.
this will not be a shock to you. I find that very unlikely, but I'd love to
Why?
be wrong. Well,
Why?
well, well, because I think it's implausible that they could survive so long. And again, me and you have different prior probabilities there, but I do think that's implausible. And I just think that there are other more plausible explanations. Like, here's one that I think deserves quite a bit of consideration. Are you familiar with the Teratorn?
No.
Teratorns are amazing. They are an extinct species of raptor, so they're actually pretty closely related to condors that lived in North America in the pretty recent past. So they're a quintessential ice age animal, and they went extinct, we think, around 10,000 years ago, not that long ago. They were absolutely gigantic. They had wingspans over 12 feet long, and they look really terrifying. Like, if you want to freak yourself out, look at recreations of Teratorns, see how tall they are, how long their wingspan was. They
That
also
would
lived,
terrify you.
they would terrify me, but they would terrify other people who don't have my bird phobia either. Um, they lived in about the same area that these Thunderbird legends come from. And again, we think they went extinct as few as 10,000 years ago. That's a short enough time frame that they could still be in the ancestral memory. I've said this on several other episodes. I'm a big proponent of these sort of ancestral memories. A story of a story of a story of a story of like your great, 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 great grandfather saw one. Then it gets passed along through the generations, gets embellished, takes on supernatural aspects, but there's a kernel of truth there. I
Mhm.
think a Teratorn, which we know lived in this area around this time period and was a gigantic, terrifying bird, is a really plausible candidate for being the inspiration for at least some of these stories.
Cool. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you on that. I think we are agreeing that these stories have a basis in reality at
So
some level,
I
right?
think,
But like we're just the creatures that get us to the reality is different.
yeah, so we both agree that these cowboy stories are extremely implausible, but the underlying Thunderbird
This
stories,
specific one is implausible.
well, I think a lot of the other ones are too if we dig into them. But yeah, if we go beyond that, I would say most of the Thunderbird legends, I'd probably just say they're mythology. So they're legends that people tell, they pass down. That is my primary candidate. I think it's plausible that some of these stories could be based on a creature like the Teratorn. It's not impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely that it could be something like a pterodactyl. I would love to be wrong though, because that would be amazing.
Cool.
How would you assess all these probabilities here?
Well, obviously, the probabilities change when you're coming at it from my perspective.
Uh-huh.
That it's not implausible that these creatures would be around with mankind and these civilizations. So, when you're coming at from my point of view, obviously, it's very plausible that some kind of pterosaur could have been around and terrorizing these Native American groups all across North America. When you're coming at from that point of view, it's just like the probability seems fairly high that they would have been interacting with dinosaurs of some kind, right? Some evidence that I would point to that is some of the pictographs that they found in various states that do resemble dinosaurs of different kinds. Specifically, the one in Utah, which I've said one expert has like very blatantly been like, no, this is three different pictographs put together. Which, when you look at it, like with his images over it, you're like, yeah, I can see that. But when you're just looking at it, you're like, it also looks like a pterosaur too. So, so yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like I think there is physical evidence too. But beyond that one, there are other pictographs too that do depict creatures that look like dinosaurs in North and South America, right? That do bring together the plausibility of the pterosaur story, right? One other further piece of evidence, just like going beyond pterosaurs, but like dinosaurs with people too. There are the fossils. I believe they're in Texas, where they have the dinosaur footprints. Is this right, Matt? And you can actually see dinosaur footprints right next to human footprints. And there's actually some I just found out about just up the road from us. That's on a military base here that I have some friends who have actually seen. That there are big dinosaur footprints going along the side of a creek, and there's human footprints going right alongside of it. That seems like evidence that, yes, these things did walk alongside each other.
So I get the feeling I will have responses to those, but I think those sound like really good future episodes to go into pictographs that could depict dinosaurs or it could be something else, and these alleged human dinosaur footprints. Check those out in future episodes. So in summary, if you are out there and you have a photo of a bunch of cowboys standing next to a dead pteranodon, let us know. But if you vaguely remember seeing one in the past but don't have it, don't waste your time looking for it. It's probably fake. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate you spending time with us on our brand new channel. If you want to watch some other similar videos, check out the one we did on the Babylonian Suresh and the account of Daniel killing a dinosaur. What?
Don't forget to boop the like and subscribe. And also feel free to leave comments. And we'll see who you all agree with.